By 1852, the gold was already gone. Not all of it, but enough. The easy gold, the kind a man could pull from a stream bed with his own hands and a tin pan, had been claimed, cleaned, and carried away by the men who arrived first. 300,000 people came to California anyway, and almost none of them got rich. Welcome to the channel. I am Clay. What you are about to hear is not the American success story version of the California gold rush. It is the one that actually happened, the one that records, letters, and death registers left behind in the archives of California courthouses and mining offices tell a story very different from the legend. If you are new here, hit subscribe before we go any further, because this is the kind of history that does not get taught in school. And drop a comment below telling me, had you ever heard the real numbers on this before today? Now, let us go back to where it all began. January 24th, 1848. A carpenter named James Marshall was inspecting the tail race of a sawmill on the American River in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, near a place called Coloma. He noticed something glinting in the shallow water. He picked it up, turned it over, pressed it, struck it, tested it the way a man would if he had heard enough campfire talk about prospecting. It was gold. His employer, John Sutter, tried to keep the discovery quiet. He had good reason to. Sutter understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a gold rush on his land would not make him rich. It would bring men who had nothing and wanted everything. Men who would strip the hills bare and leave nothing behind but chaos. He was right about that. Within a few years, his workers had abandoned his farm to go prospecting. Squatters had overrun his property, and John Sutter, one of the largest landowners in California at the time of the discovery, died essentially broke. But secrecy did not last long. By summer of 1848, word had moved through California like fire through dry grass. A newspaper editor and businessman named Sam Brannan, who had quietly bought up nearly every pickaxe, pan, and shovel available in San Francisco before the news went fully public, walked the city streets holding a glass vial of gold dust and shouting the discovery at the top of his voice. He made over $100,000 in the months that followed, not by mining, but by selling supplies to miners at prices that bore little relationship to what he had paid for them. That moment, Sam Brannan on the street in San Francisco with his vial of gold is as close to a symbol of the gold rush's true economics as history offers. The men who got rich were not the ones doing the digging. They were the ones selling the shovels. By 1849, the rush was on in earnest. Ships crowded San Francisco Bay. Men came from the eastern United States, from Mexico and Chile, from China, from Australia, from France and Germany and Ireland. They came overland across the continent on routes that killed thousands before a single flake of gold was ever found. They came by sea, around the southern tip of South America, on voyages that lasted up to 6 months. They crossed Central America on foot through malarial jungle to catch a ship up the Pacific coast. 300,000 people made it to California between 1848 and 1855. The mathematics of what awaited them was brutal. The men who arrived in 1848, a few thousand at most, worked claims that had never been touched. Some of them made extraordinary money in those first months. A lucky and skilled miner in the earliest days could earn in a single week what an Eastern factory worker made in a full year. Those stories were real. They were also almost immediately out of date. By 1850, the richest accessible surface deposits, the placer gold sitting loose in stream beds and riverbanks, had been worked over by tens of thousands of men. By 1852, mining had changed in fundamental character. Extracting meaningful amounts of gold now required hydraulic equipment, organized labor, and capital investment no individual 49er could afford. The mining companies that moved in with industrial equipment were efficient. The man working a pan alone in a cold river was not. Hydraulic mining involved directing enormous pressurized jets of water at entire hillsides to expose gold-bearing gravel beneath. It was devastatingly effective. It also obliterated the landscape for miles around and silted up rivers so severely that California courts would eventually rule against it decades later. But in the early 1850s, the only thing anyone cared about was how much gold it produced. The men who arrived late, which is to say the vast majority of the 300,000, stepped into an economy already stacked against them, and into a physical environment that was actively dangerous to survive in. The camps of the Sierra Nevada foothills in the early 1850s were not the colorful frontier towns of later mythology. They were raw, crowded, and profoundly unhealthy places. A typical mining camp might hold anywhere from a few hundred to several thousand men living in tents, rough wooden shacks, or simply out in the open. There was no sanitation infrastructure of any kind. Latrines, where they existed at all, were shallow pits dug near the same streams men used for drinking water. In camps where the population swelled faster than any planning could account for, waste of every kind ended up in the same waterways everyone depended on to survive. The consequences were predictable, and they were severe. Cholera moved through mining camps with devastating speed. The disease, spread through contaminated water, could kill a healthy man within hours of his first symptoms. Dysentery was endemic, chronic, and wearing, grinding men down over weeks and months. Scurvy appeared regularly in camps, where fresh vegetables were either unavailable or priced so high that a struggling miner simply could not reach them. The 49ers died from disease at rates that dwarfed anything violence in the camps produced. Estimates drawn from period accounts and historical records suggest that disease killed somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 of the men who spent significant time in those Sierra Nevada foothills camps. Many survivors returned home physically diminished and financially ruined. The conditions were made worse by the cost of everything. Food prices in the gold rush era were not simply high, they were extraordinary by any measurement, and they bore no relationship to what food cost anywhere else in the country. A pound of flour that sold for a few cents in Missouri could cost $1 or more in the camps. Eggs, when they were available at all, sold at prices that would translate to $15 or more each in modern terms. A decent meal at a tent restaurant could consume an entire day's earnings for a miner who was not having a good week. The men running those restaurants were making money. The miners eating in them frequently were not. And what do you think? Could you have survived something like that? Weeks in a waterlogged camp, drinking from a fouled river, eating what little you could afford, with no doctor within 30 miles? Drop it in the comments below. Medical care ranged from basic to non-existent. A miner who broke an arm or developed a serious infection was largely dependent on whatever knowledge his tentmates had accumulated through hard experience. Trained physicians existed in California during the gold rush, but they were concentrated in San Francisco and the larger towns. By the time a seriously ill man could be moved to any kind of medical attention, it was often already too late. The men who endured these conditions did so not because they were reckless or ignorant by the standards of their time. Many were skilled tradesmen, farmers, or laborers who had made a calculated decision based on the information available to them. The stories of early success were real. The newspapers that carried those stories were not always careful to include the part about how the window of opportunity had already closed by the time most readers could act on the information. A man who read about the gold rush in an Ohio newspaper in 1849 sold his farm, gathered his savings, and spent 6 months getting to California was not a fool. He was unlucky. Unlucky in timing and unlucky in the distance between what the mythology promised and what the ground actually delivered. The economic misery of the camps was only one layer of what made the California gold rush genuinely dark. Beneath the surface of the financial failure lay a racial hierarchy enforced through a combination of legal authority and organized intimidation, and it shaped the experience of a large portion of the men who came to California. The Foreign Miners Tax of 1850 was passed by California's newly formed state legislature. It imposed a monthly fee of $20 on all foreign-born miners who were not American citizens. $20 a month was not a trivial sum. It was more than many miners could reliably clear in that same period. The practical targets of the law were clear to everyone at the time: Chilean and Mexican miners, many of whom had been working California gold country since before the American military campaign that secured California in 1846, were driven from productive claims by the combination of the tax and the extra-legal pressure that frequently accompanied its enforcement. Urban groups moved through certain regions, delivering the message that foreign miners were not welcome through means more direct than legal documentation. The Chilean and Mexican communities in California, some of which had deep roots predating American sovereignty, contracted sharply in the years following the tax. The claims those miners had been working were absorbed by others. Chinese miners occupied a different position in the gold rush hierarchy, and in some ways a more consistently documented one. Beginning in the early 1850s, Chinese immigrants arrived in California in significant numbers, primarily from Guangdong province, driven by a combination of political instability at home and the same economic promises that had drawn men from everywhere else. By 1852, there were roughly 25,000 Chinese men in California. They were not permitted to work the better claims. The exclusion was maintained through a combination of intimidation, local ordinances, and physical removal. Chinese miners were effectively limited to claims already worked over by previous miners: the tailings, the leavings, the ground that others had extracted what they could from and abandoned. That these miners managed to find anything at all under those conditions reflected extraordinary patience and techniques that other miners had not considered. But the structural exclusion was real, deliberately maintained, and growing in formality as California's government developed. The position of native Californians during the gold rush was the most extreme of all, and it is one of the aspects of this history that most accounts treat with the least honesty. Before European contact, California had been home to one of the most densely populated indigenous regions in all of North America. By the time gold was discovered in 1848, the native population had already been dramatically reduced by disease, displacement, and the violence of the Spanish mission system. But tens of thousands of native Californians still lived across the region. What followed was catastrophic. In 1850, California's legislature passed a law called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. The name was a deliberate cover for what the law actually did. It created a formal system allowing the indenture of native Californians, including children, to white settlers and employers, under terms that offered no meaningful compensation and no realistic path to freedom. This was, in functional terms, a system of coerced labor operating at the same moment the rest of the country was engaged in its great debate over abolition. Beyond the formal legal structure, there were organized campaigns of violence against native communities throughout the gold rush years. State-funded militia operations were conducted across the foothills and valleys of California in the early 1850s. The state of California spent hundreds of thousands of dollars financing these operations. The native population of California, estimated at around 150,000 at the time of American acquisition, had been reduced to roughly 30,000 by 1860. Historians who have examined this period carefully have not been ambiguous about what that reduction represents. All of this was happening while the 49ers were writing home about their adventures. The long human cost of the gold rush cannot be measured only in men who died in the camps or communities driven from their claims. or the native Californians whose world was destroyed inside a single decade. It is also measured in the thousands of men who spent everything they had to reach California, found nothing worth reporting, and then discovered they did not have enough money left to leave. California's geography was not friendly to men who wanted to change their minds. Getting back to the eastern United States required either the same long sea voyage that had brought them there, or the same brutal overland crossing. Either way, it cost money. Money that men who had spent their savings on passage, provisions, camp fees, and inflated food prices often simply did not have anymore. Some of those men wrote letters home explaining their situation. Some of those letters survived. They are not letters of triumph. They are letters asking for money. Letters written with varying degrees of humiliation and desperation by men who could not yet admit to themselves that it was over, or by men who had already made peace with it and just needed a way home. Others simply stayed. They drifted into whatever work was available in a rapidly expanding California economy: agricultural labor in the Central Valley, construction work in the growing towns, domestic service, the kinds of jobs the mythology of the gold rush had never mentioned. Some built decent lives from those second chances. Others drifted further into the itinerant labor economy of the broader American West, following whatever work flickered to life in the mines of Nevada and Colorado and Arizona as subsequent rushes lit up and burned out in their turn. Their names are not in the histories. The mythology of the gold rush required a particular kind of protagonist. The self-made man who came west, endured hardship, and built something from nothing. The men who came west, found nothing, and never made it home, were not useful to that story. So the mythology edited them out and replaced them with the version of the gold rush that fit the national story America wanted to tell about itself. What the gold rush actually produced in measurable concrete terms was a state. California's non-native population expanded from roughly 14,000 in 1848 to over 300,000 by 1855. That demographic surge created real and lasting economic demand. San Francisco became one of the most significant ports on the Pacific coast within just a few years of the discovery. Agriculture in California's Central Valley began to develop the infrastructure that would eventually make it one of the most productive farming regions in the world. The Transcontinental Railroad that followed in the 1860s was partly justified by the population the gold rush had deposited in California. But the wealth generated in those years did not flow to the men who had dug for it. It flowed to the merchants who sold them supplies, to the landlords who charged them rent, to the shipping companies that charged them passage, to the investors who bought out their claims and brought in hydraulic equipment, to the lawyers and politicians who shaped California's legal framework in ways that protected property and capital far more reliably than they ever protected labor. The men who got rich from the California gold rush were, with rare exceptions, not the men holding the pan. They were the men who understood, sometimes from the very beginning, that the gold everyone was really chasing was not in the ground. So the next time someone frames the gold rush as one of the great American success stories, think about the 300,000 who came and the fraction who ever found anything worth the journey. Think about the camps with no clean water and no doctors. Think about the men who arrived too late, stayed too long, and never made it home. Think about the communities that were driven out, pushed aside, or dismantled entirely to make room for the legend. And which part of this story surprised you most? The economics, the conditions, the legal machinery built to exclude entire communities? Or the way the history was written to forget the people who did not make it? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and stick around. The real West is always more complicated and more honest than the legend.